All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to those that are here, and welcome to those that are with us on Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. We welcome you from different parts of the world. We do have a new group that takes our classes now in Uganda. It's a Jewish community there, so we welcome our friends from Uganda. And they have been participating in our classes for the last few weeks. They've sent some beautiful emails, how much they're enjoying it. So welcome, Uganda. Maybe we'll visit one day. Maybe not. I don't know. I don't think so, but maybe you'll visit us. Also want to thank the Goldshins who are sponsoring today's lecture in honor of my new grandson. His name is Yehuda Meir. He's in New York. Hopefully he's sleeping now. But thank you very much. Whenever I speak to any audience, and then post-COVID it's an audience, whether it's live or through social media, you think that everyone that's participating in some type of way really has their own story to tell. We each have our own lives which are rich in our own encounters, our own experiences. And every one of us have traveled many different paths and roads that led to this very moment. So if I was to ask you, how did you get here? The question is not by automobile or by bicycle. How did you get here means, what did it take? How many decisions in lives, how many choices in your life did it take for you to be here at this moment and at this time? And everyone could write a complete book to answer that question, because it starts off perhaps before your lifetime. It starts off in your parents' lifetime, in your grandparents' lifetime, where they were born, where they raised you, what school you went to, what interests you, what didn't interest you, what university you went to, if you went to university at all, what career you chose, who you married, etc., etc., etc. But when we're dealing with an audience, now multiply that we each have our own book. We each have our own story, our own diverse story, and yet for this one moment, for right now, those books, each of our books, somehow intermingle, and there's a page in that book that we share in common, that we hear now, that we're participating now, that we're discussing this subject now. The journeys of our lives. It makes for a very fascinating book, film, documentary, whatever you may be. So let me start with this story. At the turn of the 20th century, two of the wealthiest men in America were a pair of Jewish brothers. Their names were Nathan and Isidore Strauss. Nathan and Isidore Strauss, you may know them more by the department stores that they owned, Macy's and A&S. Anyone remember the A&S department stores on the East Coast? That was owned by these two brothers. They were multi-millionaires, and they were renowned for their philanthropy. They were big givers of charity. In 1912, the brothers and their wives took a tour of Europe. Nathan had an idea, and he said, look, we're here in Europe as it is. Let's hop over to Palestine. That's what Israel was called in 1912. We have been giving a lot of charity to Jewish communities throughout Palestine. Let's check up on them. Let's see how they're doing. We might as well. And so the brothers went to Palestine. And it wasn't exactly the tourist hotspot. It is since 1948. 1912, it was filled with disease, with famine, with poverty. But these two brothers felt this solidarity with Israel and their desire to help wherever they went. And they did go community to community in any possible way that they could help. After about a week of this, Isidore tells his brother, it's time for us to get back to Europe, time to go back. But Nathan wasn't so anxious to leave. He said, there's more that we can do over here. You go ahead, I'll follow in a few days. He just felt that there's so much more that can be done, and so he stayed on. And he continued traveling the length and the breadth of the country and contributing huge sums of charity to help the Jewish communities back then. Meanwhile, now back in Europe, Isidore Strauss is preparing to sail home aboard an ocean liner for which he had tickets for him and his wife, and for Nathan and his wife. And he sends a telegram to Nathan, you got to get back here because you're going to miss the boat if you don't. And Nathan responds, you're right, I got to get back, I'll be over. And as it turns out, Nathan's trip from Palestine to Europe gets slightly delayed. And he misses the boat that his brother was telling him, you're going to miss it. And what was so disappointing to him is that this particular ocean liner was the maiden voyage of the greatest ship ever built, of the Titanic. It was April 12th that he was supposed to be there in London, and he misses the boat. Nathan was quite upset. He was excited about going on the Titanic, and as his brother had predicted, he missed the boat. But we all know what happens next. Now, for years thereafter, Nathan Strauss was grief-stricken over the loss of his brother and sister-in-law. And he was overwhelmed by this sense of rendezvous with history, that he just happened to miss the boat, that he had tickets on the Titanic. And until his death in 1931, he focused his entire life on pursuing his philanthropic activities with a tremendous intensity. He just devoted the rest of his life to helping others. By the way, as a postscript, during those days in 1912 that he spent extra time in what was then called Palestine, he financed the creation of a brand new city on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. And since his name was Nathan, they named it after him, and that you know as Netanya. That is the city that Nathan Strauss founded in 1912 on this trip. The journeys of our lives, the circumstances of our lives. And we know that before our ancestors entered the promised land, they traveled in the wilderness. They didn't go direct from Egypt. They didn't go direct from Sinai into the promised land. They wandered in the wilderness. And in the Bible, in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, it actually talks about every stop along the way. Eila Maseh B'nai Yisrael. These are the journeys of the children of Israel. And it lists 40 stops along the way in the wilderness that they made during that 40-year wandering. And the commentaries explain to us, Eila Maseh B'nai Yisrael, these are the journeys of the children of Israel, is really a verse not just talking about our ancestors in the wilderness, but is talking about each and every single one of us. That we go through journeys in our lives. There are various different stops along the way. Now, we may think that it just happens to be some stop, but really it's been pre-planned by God Almighty that we need to make that destination part of the journeys of our lives. That every stop along the way of our lives is predetermined by God for a divine reason why we need to be there. Ever since God told Abraham, the first Jew, Lech Lecha, leave home. That's how it began. That's how the Jewish people began. That's how the chosen nation began. We've always been on the move. Lech Lecha means leave. Well, we have been on the road. We have been the world's frequent flyers. Not all the time by choice. Many a times we were forced out. We were expelled. We were kicked out of one country to the next, and we continued to journey. You know, the story of Fiddler on the Roof, where it's this constant movement, where we're going from here to there. Anyone from Hollywood listening, I've always said there should be a sequel. I would love to know the next part of the story, the next chapter. Where did the family go? Where did each of the couples of the children, where did they end up? Where did they move from there, from one spot to the next? Eila Maseh B'nai Yisrael. We're all journey people. I don't know how many of you actually were born in Agoura Hills, California. Anybody in this room? One. The fact is, we have all journeyed. We've made stops along the way. From Israel to Egypt, to Israel, to Babylon, to Spain, to Europe, to Israel again, to Africa, to India, to Asia, to Australia, to America. Over the past 3,700 years, we have journeyed across every continent. Today we have, as I said, Jews in Uganda, Jews in Angola, Jews in Vietnam, in Thailand. We have a Chabad in Oklahoma and in Montana and in Alaska. We're everywhere. Jews are everywhere. Why? Why does God want us everywhere? So the Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, teaches that when God created the world, He scattered sparks of holiness throughout the world. These hidden spiritual treasures waiting to be unleashed, waiting to be uncovered. And it's somehow the mission of the Jew to encounter these sparks and unleash these sparks for the entire world to benefit from it. And so throughout the world, Jewish communities needed to constantly establish themselves in different places to somehow unleash holiness that was hidden in the world from the 6 days of creation. So there's a divine intent, there's a divine purpose for each and every single one of our stops along the way. We have a mission to fulfill. Now, whether we fulfill that mission or not, that's free choice. That's up to us. But that there is a mission to be accomplished at every stop along the way, that's divine. That's pre-planned. We're all familiar with the word bashert, right? You've heard that word bashert. And we always use that word bashert to talk about what? To talk about a couple, dating, people getting together, getting married, bashert. But the word bashert is bigger than that. It's not just who you marry. Bashert means it's meant to be, destiny. But it's every stop along the way of our lives is bashert. Where we are, the careers we chose, the house we live in, bashert. So let me tell you a story about bashert, meant to be. This goes back more than 50 years ago with Rabbi David Shachat of Toronto, Canada. He was asked to give a lecture to a non-Jewish group in the city of Buffalo, New York. Now, being that he would be speaking to a non-Jewish audience, he wrote to the Lubavitcher Rebbe to ask, A, should I accept this gig? You know, I understand speaking to Jewish audiences. I've never gotten a request to speak to a non-Jewish audience. And if I do accept it, what should I speak about? The Rebbe tells him, accept the offer, speak, and you should speak about the mitzvah of charity. Charity is universal. For all religions, people of all faiths, speak about charity. So he gets up and he takes the trip to Buffalo, and he's giving this lecture. And as part of this lecture on charity, he told the following story. So now you're getting a story within the story. This is the story in the lecture Rabbi Shachat is telling to this audience in Buffalo, New York. And he tells about a city called Krakow, a city in Poland. And in this city in Krakow, there lived a very wealthy individual who contributed nothing to charity. He was known as the town's miser. In fact, that's what everyone called him, the miser of Krakow. Why? He was the wealthiest fellow, and anytime there was a need, they couldn't collect from him. Now, after this miser passed away, the Chevra Kadisha, that's the Jewish Burial Society, decided that for this individual, they're not going to give him a select spot in the Jewish section of the cemetery. They're going to give him a spot in what was called hektish, kind of like the anonymous section, the John Doe section within the cemetery, as a sign of this fellow was not really that well loved in our community. And the funeral took place, and that's where he was buried, in this kind of anonymous section called hektish, the society's outcasts. And that's where he was buried. A few days after the funeral, there's a commotion in town. Two prominent members of the community, the butcher and the baker, who had always been extremely charitable, suddenly stopped distributing funds to the poor. They had a tradition that any Friday before Shabbat, anyone that would come into the butcher and say, we don't have the funds to buy meat or chicken for Shabbat, it would be a gift. The same with the bakery. It was known, you didn't have funds, you're going to have food for Shabbat, you go to the butcher, you go to the baker, they'll take care of you. That Friday, they both stopped. And all the poor of the town can't figure out what's going on. So they go to the rabbi of the city. His name was Rabbi Yom Tov. He was known by the name the Tosfos Yom Tov because he wrote a book called the Tosfos Yom Tov. His real name was Rabbi Yom Tov Lippman. They go to the rabbi of the town and they complain, the poor, that the butcher and the baker who for years have been supplying us for food for Shabbat, this week announced no more free food. What are we supposed to do? So Rabbi Lippman calls the butcher and the baker. What's going on? Why would you stop such a beautiful mitzvah? And they both said, you think all these years we were able to afford giving out free food? It was the miser. The miser every week would tell us, you give away whatever you need to give, you keep a tab, and I pay the bill. But there's one condition. No one can ever know. If anyone finds out, it stops. The miser was our biggest customer. We made more money from the miser than from the entire community because of all the charity that was coming through our store. And he would pay us on time. But he died. We can't continue to afford to do this. Rabbi Lippman was shocked. He went to the grave of the miser. He went day after day after day begging forgiveness as to how he was treated in his death. How disrespectful it was for him to be buried in this section of the cemetery. And he, as the rabbi, let it happen and didn't stop it. And he cried and he cried and he begged for this forgiveness. When Rabbi Lippman passed away, he left instructions that he wanted to be buried right next to the miser. That's where he wanted his spot. Rabbi Shachat is telling the story in Buffalo, New York, that people can visit the Jewish cemetery in Krakow, and you can go to the burial site of the famed Tosfos Yom Tov, and there you will see buried right next to him is the holy miser of Krakow. He was explaining this as part of this lecture on charity, the idea of giving anonymously, giving without the covet, without the honor. He concludes the lecture, and a participant from the audience, who happened to be a priest, comes up to Rabbi Shachat and says, that story you told, can you repeat it again? He said, it's late and I traveled today, I'm tired, I'm staying at a hotel right nearby. If you want to meet me for a cup of coffee in the morning, we'll talk, we'll have a conversation. Sure. He didn't think the priest was actually going to show up, but sure enough, in the morning he's there in the lobby. They sit down. He repeats the story. He says, it's a fascinating story. The priest says, I want you to know that the miser of your story is my ancestor. So Rabbi Shachat smiled and said, I don't think so. First of all, this story took place hundreds of years ago. Not 10 years ago, not 20 years ago. It's hundreds of years back. Secondly, I don't know if I mentioned it, but he was Jewish. And from the way you're dressed, I don't think you're too Jewish. So the priest says, now I have a story to tell you. I grew up in Tennessee. My father was a major in the United States Army during the Second World War. While overseas in Europe, he met a Jewish girl, and he fell in love. He brought her home as his bride, and no one in Tennessee knew that she was Jewish. She kept it a secret all of her life. A short time after their marriage, they had a child, me. They raised me in Catholic tradition. I grew up and I attended seminary, and eventually I trained to become a priest. A number of years ago, my mom became very sick. And she called me to her bedside. And she said, my son, I know I don't have much time, but I do need to tell you before I leave this world, I'm Jewish. And therefore, by Jewish tradition, by Jewish law, you're Jewish. I'm sorry I never shared this with you, but I felt you should know. And just to tell you a little bit about my lineage, it's been passed on in our family that our ancestor, going back a number of generations, is buried in a cemetery in Krakow next to a famous rabbi, and he was known as the Holy Miser. That's all I know about my family. I don't know much about my mother's family. All I know is that she told me some strange story about a miser going a number of generations back, buried in Krakow next to a famous rabbi. I'm listening to your story last night. You talk about Krakow, you talk about a rabbi, you talk about a miser, you talk about a cemetery. I must be from that. I'm Jewish. I'm a descendant of the miser. What should I do now? Rabbi Shachat, who's a brilliant man, says, here's the phone number of Chabad in Buffalo, be in touch with them. I believe it was Rabbi Garari from the Chabad in Buffalo that he put him in touch with, and he got back on the plane and went to Toronto. He put it out of his mind. Fast forward a number of years. Rabbi Shachat is visiting the Western Wall in Yerushalayim. He's praying at the wall, and someone yells out, Rabbi Shachat. Turns around, do we know each other? You don't remember me. He sees this Hasidic-looking guy in a beard praying away, and he says, do we know each other? He says, the priest in Buffalo. That's me. I started learning, I started studying, I gave up the priesthood, I got back to my roots, learned all about Judaism, I made Aliyah, I live here, I'm married now with a family. And here is, as we used to call it, the rest of the story. Who was the fellow that did that show on the radio? Paul Harvey. Fast forward in the story another few years, Rabbi Shachat started looking into his own genealogy. And what he discovered was that he was a direct descendant of Rabbi Yosef Lipman. Of the rabbi and the miser that had this relationship hundreds of years ago, it's now hundreds of years later. And somehow, at this auspicious juncture in time, in a hotel lobby in Buffalo, New York, because of an invitation that Rabbi Shachat gets to speak to a non-Jewish audience that he doesn't know if he should accept, that he's advised by his Rebbe to speak about charity, that he chooses to tell a particular story at that moment. A descendant of Rabbi Yosef Lipman meets a descendant of the Holy Miser and finally brings about the forgiveness that he begged for in his lifetime. The connectivity. Sometimes it's right there, sometimes it's decades later, sometimes it's hundreds of years apart. There's a connectivity between our souls that is beyond what we can see in the here and now. Who sent Rabbi Shachat to Buffalo? We're going to think it was an invitation. We're going to think someone heard him speak and someone told someone in this group to get. No. Eila Maseh B'nai Yisrael. These are the journeys that God sets for his people. They're set by divine. It's our choice to accept. It's our choice to do what we need to do. But that there's something to be accomplished at a particular place in a particular time, that's set by divine. All of our life's experiences, including our frustrations and our setbacks and our disappointments and our joys and our celebrations and our successes and our victories, are all part of the journeys of our life to take us to our own promised land where we need to go. God guides the footsteps of man. Every one of our journeys are custom made specifically for his or her needs. Our journeys can either turn out to be meaningless treks that might as well never happen if we fail to exercise our free choice and take advantage of the settings that God is placing on this pathway of our journey. The Talmud tells us a story about Reuven. The Talmud describes and tells us the details about the story in the Torah about Reuven. Let me set the story for you. You're familiar with it. It's the story of Joseph, right? The brothers don't like Joseph too much. You've either read it in Genesis or you saw the play, one or the other. And they plot against him, right? And so when they're alone and they see him coming and he's coming to find the brothers, because the father says, I don't know whether your brothers are, go find them. And he goes and he finds them and they plot against him. Now ultimately what do? First they want to kill him, then they say, no, we can't kill him. Then they throw him in a pit, and then they sell him as a slave. He ends up in Egypt, and the entire story unfolds. But there is a part of the story with the brother Reuven. Reuven is the firstborn. And Reuven is the one that says to the brothers, we can't hurt him. We're not going to harm him. And he says, we're going to throw him in a pit instead, and we'll walk away. But the Torah there testifies to us that Reuven actually had good intentions. That Reuven did not feel strong enough to reprimand the brothers and say, don't you touch him. But at the same time, he was kind enough that he didn't want his brother Joseph harmed. So he had a plan. I will appease the brothers by saying, throw Joseph in a pit. I'll wait for them to leave, and I'll go rescue him from the pit. So the Torah testifies to us that although Reuven is the one that says throw him in a pit, he had no intentions of hurting him. In fact, he wanted to save him. And then later when Reuven comes back and he's not in the pit, he can't figure out what happened because he wasn't there when they sold him as a slave. Now the Talmud comes in. This is what the Talmud says about this little episode. Had Reuven known, had he known that this story would have been recorded in the Torah for thousands of years, for millions of students of the Bible to read, how he would have postured himself differently. He would have found the strength within himself to put his arms around Joseph and tell the brothers, no one is touching him. Had he only known that this story was going to make it big. That's what the Talmud tells us. So what does this mean? Had he known that it would be a bestseller, had he known it would make it to Broadway, he would have behaved differently? I think what the Talmud is saying is, had he stopped and thought about the far-reaching effects that a decision we make in life can have, if he only took that time to stop and think it through, we know he was a good guy. He just didn't have the courage to follow through. And sometimes to get the courage that we need at that moment, we need to stop and think of what the consequences of our actions may be. Not tomorrow, not next year, but a decade, a generation, a century later. You never know which event that we experience, which part of our journey we experience, has history making written all over it. That it's such a critical decision for the rest of our lives. We simply don't know. Like Reuven didn't know, we don't know. And so we have to think and treat every decision we make as the possibility that this is going to have a critical effect on the rest of our journey. But this I will tell you, is that any time that God places us in a situation where we have a choice to do something good or just ignore it and walk away, seize that opportunity. Seize that moment. Because if God placed you within an opportunity to do something good, there's a reason he put you there. There's a reason he opened this up before your eyes. There's something he needs of you to accomplish, because he placed you at the scene where someone needs to take some action. Another story from the Talmud tells us about the great sage Rabbi Yochanan. At the time of this story, Rabbi Yochanan is already an old-timer, and he's walking with his students. He has many students. He's walking from Tiberias to the city of Tzfas in northern Israel. Anyone familiar geographically where Tiberias is and Tzfat? It's a nice winding road. I believe it's about 18 miles uphill if you're going from Tiberias to Tzfas, and it's quite winding. So they're walking the 18 miles. It's a nice hike. As they're climbing, Rabbi Yochanan is poor. He can't afford a donkey, so they're walking it. They pass this huge field along the way. And Rabbi Yochanan says to his students, you see this field? It once belonged to me. I once owned this, but I sold it so that I can have a yeshiva for you students. In order to open a school, I needed funds, so I sold this field. He continues the walk, and they see this orchard. He says, you see this orchard? I also own this orchard, but I sold it in order to keep the yeshiva open. 3 different occasions, he's pointing out different real estate that he owned. And now he can't even afford a donkey. And now this old man is making a hike of 18 miles because he doesn't have the funds to buy a donkey. And so the students cry out, how sad this is, Rebbe. How sad to see you so poor when you had so much that you have nothing left. And Rabbi Yochanan says to his students, don't be sad for me at all. Rejoice for me, because I don't regret 1 minute of my life of selling away the property so that I can have the school for all of you students. There's no regret with me. I am overjoyed. It's been 1,800 years since that story was told in the Talmud. So now we're fast forwarding almost 2,000 years since Rabbi Yochanan lived on this earth. Today, you can go into any study hall where they're studying the Talmud, anywhere in the world, and you will hear the name of Rabbi Yochanan mentioned hundreds of times. Amar Rabbi Yochanan taught us this, Rabbi Yochanan taught this, over and over. So over the history of 2,000 years, his name and his teachings have been taught millions of times. Now with the return, so to say, of the last decade or two of the study of Talmud in mass, which has been going on in the last few decades all over the world, imagine the name of Rabbi Yochanan now. How many times his name is being studied for his teachings? Who would have remembered his fields 2,000 years later? He knew what he wanted to focus his life on. He knew what was eternal. He knew what would remain. So if we want to give something to the next generation, to our children, to our grandchildren, we want to pass something on. Of course, we want to pass on wealth. We want to pass on lots of whatever we can. We want them to live comfortable lives. But we also want to pass on our teachings. We want to pass on our true valuables, our heritage, our traditions. We want to make sure we pass those along as well, so that our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren, they will remember us not just for the gifts of material that we gave them, but for the gifts of the spiritual that we gave them as well. I read in this book written by Rabbi Benjamin Blech, in which he describes this scene from a comedy film. The main actor the main character is played by Billy Crystal in this film, and he's asked to go to his son's school and speak to his son's class. It's a comedy film, and Billy Crystal's a great comedic actor. And he gets up there and he says, value this time in your life, kids. It goes by fast. When you're a teenager, you think you can do anything, and you do. Your 20s are a blur. Your 30s, you raise a family, you make a little money, you think to yourself, what happened to my 20s? When you get into your 40s, you grow a little pot belly, you grow another chin, the music starts to get too loud. One of your friends from high school becomes a grandmother. In the 50s, you have minor surgery, you call it a procedure, but it's surgery. You get to your 60s, now you have major surgery. The music is still too loud, but it doesn't matter because you can't hear it anyway. You get to your 70s, you and your wife retire, and you move to Fort Lauderdale. You start eating dinner at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You have lunch around 10 o'clock. You have breakfast the night before. You spend most of your time wandering around shopping malls looking for the men's room and muttering, how come the kids don't call? How come the kids don't call? So how do we assure that our lives don't mirror Billy Crystal's monologue? How do we pass on to our children that there's more to life than just the skills to earn a respectable income? how to love and how to be loved, how to be a giver and not just a taker, how to fulfill their life's mission and leave a permanent mark rather than just survive. How will they learn the essential things that can lend meaning and purpose to every day of their lives? The only force that will infuse our children and ourselves with a higher sense of value and purpose is spirituality. And for us, that's Judaism. That's Yiddishkeit, a spirited Judaism, not a cold Judaism, but a Judaism that's alive with its richness, a deep sense of the soul, of the spirit within us, of the mission of the soul, of the journey of the soul. So if you want to give your children and your grandchildren that which will last, give them the gift of Jewish memories. Let them understand the greatness from which they come, the greatness of the journey of the Jewish people, going all the way back from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob and on the way through. Back in 1990, when communism finally fell apart and Hungary gained independence from the Soviet Union, people suddenly had freedoms the likes of which they hadn't seen since 1956 when Russia invaded Hungary. For the first time in decades, people were able to make their own choices regarding the schooling of their children. Okay? Freedom broke out. You can pick what type of school. And so like everywhere, if you remember those days in the 90s where suddenly the old Soviet Union collapses and every country is facing freedoms, Jewish schools began opening up all over the old Soviet Empire. And here in Hungary, they want to open Jewish schools. Now, where is everyone going to turn to find teachers? So the calls were coming into New York, send reinforcements. We need people willing to teach in what was then Russia and Ukraine and Hungary and Czechoslovakia, all these places. In 1990, suddenly, boom, we need educators willing to travel to not the Agora Hills necessarily, right? So a team of American teachers and rabbis came to Hungary to spearhead the effort. They placed an ad in the paper that they're here and they're hoping to start a school, and they're hoping for about 50 kids. They rent a facility where they can house 50 children. They have maybe 3 teachers with them. They can figure out how to divide the kids. And they have a date for orientation in this newspaper ad to come to this office that they rented, and we're going to have an orientation session, what our plans are. They show up and they can't believe their eyes because there's 450 people waiting for them. So besides for calling New York and saying, help, they don't know what they're supposed to even do with orientation. We're not prepared for this. So they broke up the group into smaller groups. We'll interview 10 at a time. We'll take notes and then we'll have to get back to the community as to what the plan will be. And as they broke into smaller groups, they started interviewing the families, trying to understand what happened here. This was not no major media blitz. This was one small ad. What took place? Why are so many Jewish families interested in sending their kids to a Jewish school? When we open Jewish schools in communities, it's usually a job of persuading families, take your kid out of public school, send them to a Jewish school. And here, there's lines. So each parent started giving answers. One said there's anti-Semitism in the public schools, and the moment they heard there's a chance of a Jewish school, they'd rather have that. Others said nostalgia. They remembered their bubby, they remembered some Jewish traditions, and they want to see to it that their children have it. Each one had a different reason. And in one of these breakout groups, there was a father who wasn't saying much. And finally, the rabbi that was conducting this put him on the spot and said, and what's your reason, sir? Why are you here? He said, it's actually difficult for me to speak about it. I've never spoken publicly about it, but because you asked, I'll tell you. I was a child of 7 years old when the Germans occupied Hungary in 1944. They knew that the war was almost over for them, but in their sick obsession to kill as many Jews as possible, they rounded up as many Jews as they could to send off to Auschwitz. Hungarian Jewry was terrified. One night, I was lying in bed, and I heard my parents arguing frantically. My parents never argued. So the fact that they were having a heated conversation got my attention. This is odd. So it was a 2-story house. I came downstairs to see what's going on. What are they arguing about? But the door to the living room was locked, which again was an oddity. But the locks in those days were the old-fashioned locks where you actually could see through. So I bent down to peek through to see what was going on in there. I looked through the keyhole. My father was very agitated. And he was saying to my mother, "We don't have to worry. We don't have to worry. Because no one knows that we're Jewish. It's not our concern. No one knows we're Jewish. We don't look Jewish. We never did anything Jewish. We have no Jewish friends. There's no proof in this house of our Jewish identity. We're going to get away with it." My mother said, "Rumor has it that they come into towns with lists. They have printed up lists. That's the rumor that I heard. Maybe our name is on that list." This is the panic that's going through community after community in Hungary. This is what this boy is 7 years old, is watching this argument between father and mother through this keyhole. To which my father says to my mother, "Let's suppose we're on that list," which I would have no way, why would our name be on this list? Who even knows that we're Jewish? But let's suppose that our name is on the list. They'll come here and they'll look through the house and we'll prove to them that we're not Jewish. Again, the psyche thinking that you could reason with the Nazis. We'll let them go through the whole house. They'll find nothing Jewish. And we'll survive. As my father said these words to my mother, "They'll look through the whole house and they will find nothing here that's Jewish," he begins to stare at the bookcase. And then I see my mother staring at the bookcase. And they're both staring at the same shelf on the bookcase. My mother makes her way to the bookcase. She reaches up to the shelf that they're looking at. And she takes down, which was a siddur, a Jewish prayer book. It was a Jewish prayer book that her mother gave her as a wedding gift on the day of her wedding, because it belonged to her mother's mother, who got it on the day of her wedding from her mother, because it belonged to, going all the way back generation after generation, passed on daughter to daughter on the days of their weddings. And my mother is holding this prayer book in her hand. And she opens up the cover where she sees the names of her mother and her grandmother, and she begins to cry. She puts her lips to the pages of the prayer book of the siddur and she kisses it. And then she turns to my father, who nods his head. And then she takes that prayer book and she tossed it into the fireplace. And she fell on the floor crying as she watched this prayer book burn. My father and my mother cried that night. I ran to my room. I went under my covers and I cried like I never cried before. No, I knew nothing about what it meant to be a Jew. I never did anything Jewish. I had no Jewish friends. And yet I knew, watching that flames touch that prayer book, that something deep from within my soul, even as a 7-year-old, I knew something horrible just happened. It's been many years since that night, and I've never gotten over the tears and the sight of watching that prayer book burn. And so you ask me, why am I here? Why do I want to send my child to this school? I'll tell you why. On the first day of school, I'm going to walk into his classroom proudly holding his hand. And I'm going to hand him a siddur, a prayer book. And my tears from that night will finally stop flowing. That's the awesomeness and the eternity of the Jew. The journey must continue. The journey must go on. The faith and the devotion and the perseverance of the Jew goes on. The journeys of the Jewish people are not separated, isolated incidents. It's all part of one continuum. The past is connected to the present is connected to the future, and all of our journeys are interrelated and they're all interconnected. And yes, part of our journey was very difficult. Part of our journey was extremely painful. And not only have we survived each and every one of them, we have emerged from them stronger, prouder, more resilient than before. Wherever we went, we didn't allow the flames of evil and hatred to engulf us, to consume us, to shut us down. From out of every darkness of our history for thousands of years, new light has come forth. From out of every tragedy and setback, there's been renaissance and renewal. From every stretch of pain and adversity, we found new reasons for celebration and rejuvenation. That's our history. We're all links in this vital chain. We're connecting our parents and our grandparents to our children and our grandchildren. Jewish history and destiny waits for each and every single one of us to actualize our life's calling by making our own unique mark and our own contribution. So here we're in the 21st century. We've come through pogroms. We've come through holocausts. In this country, we have the ability to build one Jewish community after the next, one synagogue after the next, one day school after the next, one Hebrew school after the next. Our journey is to build. Our part of our history's journey is to build up from the ashes. Not to allow the past to bring us down, not to allow the pain to bring us down, but to find the strength within us to build, to grow, to reach out, to invite in, to welcome our fellow Jew, not to judge, not to condemn, not to isolate. We're not here to build shtetls where we put a wall around ourselves and have nothing to do with the outside. That's the challenge of our generation. That's the challenge of our times. I want to share an amazing story with you. One of my father's closest friends growing up from his days in childhood, my father grew up in a shtetl in Poland called Chmelnik. And he grew up together with his closest friend. His name was Chaim Meir Bucket, of blessed memory. Those of you that know Rabbi Eli and Shani Friedman from Chabad in Calabasas, Shani Friedman is a granddaughter of Chaim Meir Bucket. Rabbi Bucket was the patriarch of a beautiful family. Many of his children and grandchildren serve as Chabad rabbis and rebbitzins all over the world, as I mentioned, including here in Southern California. Rabbi Bucket during the year was a rebbe in yeshiva in Brooklyn. During the summertime, he would go up to the Catskills in New York, where he would have a summer yeshiva program. In the summer of 1970, for whatever reason, the learning program in the Catskills was canceled that summer. There was no program. So he's schwitzing in Brooklyn. His daughter, Rochi of blessed memory, who lived at the time in Westwood, California, her and her husband, Rabbi Yerachmiel Stillman, served as the Chabad rabbi in the Westwood Chabad house at the time, on the college campus. said to their father and father-in-law, why are you going to stay in Brooklyn for the summer if you're not going to the Catskills? Why don't you get on the train with the kids and come out to California? Meet Mickey Mouse. Travel at that time in 1970 was not the easiest thing. Traveling with kids was not the easiest thing. It's not like today where you just buy a ticket. It was a great expense. Again, similar as to Rabbi Shachat's story, he asks the Lubavitcher Rebbe if I should take my daughter up on the offer, and he says, great idea, you should go. He arrives after a long travel in California. He's at this home of the Stillmans, and it's coming time for Shabbos. And now Rabbi Stillman needs to explain to this Rosh Yeshiva, I need you to understand what Rabbi Bucket looks like. He's a man, sagely looking white beard, holy looking fellow. And he needs to explain that davening at a Chabad house is a little bit different than your Orthodox shul in Brooklyn. He has his own shul, Rabbi Bucket. He's a rabbi of his own congregation. It doesn't look exactly the same, especially Westwood was filled with college students. It's a happening place. And Rabbi Bucket gets the idea. He says, you don't have to worry about me. Don't worry about it. I'm going to enjoy myself. And he does. He loves it. He's singing and clapping with the college students. He doesn't want to accept Rabbi Kunan's offer to sit up front. No, he wants to hang out with the college guys and sing and dance with them. After the Friday night dinner, the Chabad house on campus is a Friday night dinner. And again, Rabbi Kunan invites him to sit at the main table. He says, no, I'm hanging out with the college students. I'm having such a good time. He ends up sitting next to someone named Tuvia. That's the fellow's name that he's sitting next to. Now, Tuvia, it was one of these genius college students. He knew so many different languages. They got into discussions about languages. An eccentric fellow, a genius. He knew 17 languages, including Yiddish, so he was able to talk to Rabbi Bucket in Yiddish. Now, at one point, Tuvia asks Rabbi Bucket, where are you originally from? And he says, from Poland. He says, I know you're from Poland, but we're in Poland. He said, so it's a little shtetl, you never heard of it. It's called Chmelnik. And Tuvia says, Chmelnik? My grandparents are from Chmelnik. Not only are they from Chmelnik, but they belong to a society here in Los Angeles called the Chmelnik Society. There's an actual society here in Los Angeles of survivors of Chmelnik. Now, my father and Rabbi Bucket, who lived in Brooklyn, had no idea. There was no internet those days that you could find out that there's other people from Chmelnik that survived. So this is the first that Rabbi Bucket is hearing that there's a Chmelnik society. From who? From the college student that he's sitting at the Shabbos table with named Tuvia. Rabbi Bucket tells Tuvia that he was an only child. And for years and years, he's been trying to find some record, some trace as to what happened to his parents. But he's never found any witnesses. They know that the town was destroyed by the Nazis, but that's all they knew. Maybe someone from the society knows something. If you can get in touch with the society after Shabbos, tell them that I'm visiting. I'd love to speak to someone. Shabbos is over. Sunday goes by, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. The phone rings in the Stillman house. My name is Chana. I'm a member of a small group called the Chmelnik Society. I'm a friend of Tuvia's grandparents. Tuvia told his grandparents who he met, and the grandparents told the society, and now someone from the society is calling and asking to meet with Rabbi Bucket. Now, you get that type of phone call that someone wants to meet with you, and you imagine how you begin to feel. You don't know what you're going to hear. You don't know how to prepare yourself for what you're going to hear. On one hand, you want to hear. On the other hand, do you really want to hear? And he told his whole family, I want you to be with me. And I want everyone to get dressed in their Shabbos clothes, because whatever we're going to hear is going to be that significant. And they, Thursday night, met at the Chabad house in Westwood on Gailey Avenue. The woman was there, a very distinguished, elderly-looking lady. And she says to Rabbi Bucket, I knew your parents very well. I was a very close friend of your mother, Rachel. I want you to know what happened on the last days. And she begins to tell the painful end of the city of Chmelnik. She said, your mother, my daughter, and I were put into a boxcar together. Most of Chmelnik was wiped out in Chmelnik. Some were put into boxcars. Your mother, myself, and my daughter. We were being transported to the Treblinka death camp. We stayed close to each other throughout the journey. Now, while this train is going, I looked up and I saw that there's this little window with this narrow opening on the top of the car. And I noticed that every once in a while the train would slow down. So I told your mother, let's try to climb up. And the next time the train slows down, push ourselves through that opening and jump off the train. If we don't survive, we're not going to survive anyway. But if miracle of miracles we do, let's try. Your mother told me she was in no condition to make the attempt. She was too old, too frail, and she just said no. But she kept on saying, but you go, you have your daughter with you, you go, you try. And I said, I can't go without you. And she kept on saying, no, I insist, you go. And the next time the train slowed down, first I hoisted my daughter up, and she was able to make her way through this opening and wait on the top of the train. And then the people in the train pushed me up. And right before leaving, your mother grabbed me. And she held my face in her hands. And she said this, but promise me, if you survive, and you ever meet my son, Chaim Meir, I want you to give him a message from me. Tell him, Ich hab gemacht a Zecher. I left an imprint in this world. I left something over. I left a memory in this world. Our lives were not for naught, because they'll never take away that Zecher, that memory. Our journey will go on. Tell my son, Ich hab gemacht a Zecher. I left an imprint in this world. She told me those words eye to eye. And with that, she pushed me up. And I and my daughter jumped off that train. And somehow we survived. In all the years since, I've wondered, were you alive? Did Chaim Meir make it? Will I ever meet him? Will I ever be able to give over my best friend's message? And then when Tuvya's grandparents told me there was a rabbi at the Chabad house named Chaim Meir Bucket, I knew the day has come. And so I'm here. And I see you and your beautiful family. Your mother knew what she was talking about. She left an imprint in this world. And that's you. Eila Maseh B'nai Yisrael. These are the journeys of the children of Israel. Throughout our lives, our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents, they send us messages and they're telling us, we left an imprint in this world. Now it's your time. It's your turn. And they're depending on us to carry the legacy of their souls forward, to carry on their journey. We are their memory. Through us, they live on. Through us, their destiny is realized. They are invested in our lives, in the choices we make, in the actions we take. They're praying for us. They're guiding us. They're encouraging us. They're pleading with us to focus on the journey, to take advantage of each day, of each opportunity, and create an everlasting imprint in this world. You see, spiritual journeys know no bounds. They transcend time and space. They are forever. They can be years apart, they can be centuries apart, and they can be worlds apart. And yet we still feel their presence in our midst. We don't understand God's ways. None of us do. We can't begin to understand why our people have had to take journeys like the Jewish people. We can't begin to understand the pogroms and the Holocausts on October the 7th. We can't fathom any understanding as to why we have gone through the difficult and painful times that we as a people have gone through. But at the same time, we have to remember that our journey through these thousands of years has brought us to this moment where for the majority of Jews in the world, for the first time in thousands of years, we have that freedom to practice how we want to practice. You realize that throughout most of the history, we didn't have that. Throughout most of history, the majority of the Jewish people were under tyrants and dictators who wouldn't allow us to practice. Even the old Soviet Union is no more. There's day schools and yeshivas all throughout the old Soviet Union. We, this generation, you and me, we are the contractors of Jewish history. We are the builders of Jewish history. We are the fortunate generation that we can serve God in freedom, in times of plenty. In closing, there's something personal I want to share with you. I think it was about maybe 16 or 17 years ago. This building wasn't here. The parking lot wasn't here. This was just an empty piece of land, a lot of grass. We bought the land behind our synagogue years ago with the hope that one day we're going to build a center just like this. It was a dream. And we finally, again, I think it was about 16 years ago, we had a groundbreaking ceremony on this lawn. Anyone here at the groundbreaking ceremony? Jeffrey, you were here? Okay. Now, my father of blessed memory, he called me from New York on several occasions, asking me for a favor. Being that he wouldn't be here for the groundbreaking ceremony, he asked if I can ask someone to represent him and take a shovel and dig up some dirt and say, this is for Mordechai Meir HaKohen Bryski. That's what he asked. I said, sure. A week before the groundbreaking, he calls me again. Moshe, I just want to remind you, if you could do me a favor, I know you're very busy, but if you can ask someone during the groundbreaking to take a shovel, pick up some dirt, this is for Mordechai Meir HaKohen Bryski. I said, sure, I'll do it. No problem. Midnight, the night before the groundbreaking. Now, midnight by us is 3 a.m. in New York. My father calls me. I said, Tal, what's wrong? I just was thinking in a few hours is the groundbreaking. If it's not too much of a bother, can you ask someone to please take a shovel, pick up some dirt, and say, this is for Mordechai Meir HaKohen Bryski. Of course, I'll do it. Sunday, the event was beautiful. We had a big crowd here. We did the digging. I had someone dig the shovel for him. Right after it's over, my father calls me. How did the event go? Did you remember? Yeah, Todd, it went beautiful. I'll send you the pictures. Okay. A few days after the event, the groundbreaking, it was Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur time. My parents decide, you know what, for Yom Kippur, we're going to come out to California. The groundbreaking was a few days before Rosh Hashanah, so this is like a week later. So I'm coming from the airport now with my parents in the car. And my father says to me, "Is there still some earth there?" I said, "You mean in the lot?" He said, "Yeah, is there still a shovel around? Now that I'm here, could we possibly go and I'll take the shovel myself?" That's a great idea. Sure. We come right up here. Still had the shovels out. I gave my father the shovel and a hard hat. I still remember Jay Lewitt. I don't know if you know Jay. Jay happened to be, at the time, at Chabad. And I said, "Jay, can you take a picture of this?" Because to me, it was just this very special moment. And my father had a hard hat out and a shovel. That's him that day. He had this look of mission accomplished. And I've always wondered, why was it so important to my father to be part of this groundbreaking for this center? He wasn't into photo ops, but yet he needed to be here. And when he didn't think he was going to be here, he called once, twice, a third time. "Make sure someone remembers me when you're doing this groundbreaking." And when he came here, I don't think really it was because of Yom Kippur services, although he loved it coming out here for high holiday services. I think he needed to be here for that groundbreaking. And the fact that my father would go to all of his friends in Brooklyn and he would raise funds for the construction of this building, even though he's not a fundraiser. And I think the answer was rather obvious. Because after having been through what he'd been through in his life, and after seeing what he had seen, and having lost what he lost, he saw the journey come full circle. The shtetl of Chmelnik, where he and his friend Rabbi Bucket grew up, was once bursting with the energy of Yiddishkeit, of Judaism. Its streets on a Friday afternoon was hustle and bustle of a Jewish community getting ready for Shabbos. The cheder had been echoing with the words of Chumash and Talmud. The synagogue was this majestic edifice radiating holiness and spirituality. So many lives, so many wonderful, precious lives, torn, destroyed, taken away, burned to the ground. And having been part of a journey of destruction, my father saw the awesome hand of Jewish destiny beckoning him to be part of the journey of renewal, of rebuilding, of building for his children and his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren. God bless my father with long life, that he was able to live not just for the groundbreaking, but he came here for the building dedication. And he had the honor a few months before he left this world of putting up the mezuzah on the front door of this building, dedicating this building on the day of its opening. As Jews, we never forget. We never stop crying over what we've lost, but at the same time, we never stop journeying onwards. We go on building bigger and stronger, better and brighter. There will be no physical destruction of our people. There will be no spiritual destruction of our people. Am Yisrael Chai. We will go on. We will be strong. And the day is very close at hand when the entire landscape of our history will finally be revealed before us. We will finally understand how these millions of journeys stretching across thousands of years and over millions of miles all lead to one central journey, one destination, one time and space, that all roads will lead to Israel, to Eretz Yisrael, with the coming of the righteous Mashiach, when all the sparks that God planted in the world during the 6 days of creation will have been extracted, and all the journeys and the missions completed. And on that incredible and awesome day, God and humanity, physical and spiritual, past and present, will converge in this terrific unity As we say in our prayers, Bayom hahu yiyeh Hashem echad u'shemo echad, the world will be at peace, the world will be one with godliness, spirituality, and goodness. May it happen speedily in our days. Amen.